He was a king who had everything: power, wealth, and a crown that ruled half the world. But when he met one woman, he chose love over a throne. This is the true story of the man who gave up his crown for the woman he loved. Chapter 1. The Lonely Prince. Prince Edward was born in 1894. His father, King George V, was a tall and serious man who did not like children. "Why does Edward talk so much?" he once said. "He's such a noisy boy." His mother, Queen Mary, agreed. "It doesn't matter if he's happy or not," she said. "A child must be quiet and strong." The family lived in Buckingham Palace. It was a very large house with 600 rooms, 8 kitchens, 19 bathrooms, 24 toilets, 11 dining rooms, 17 bedrooms, and 21 sitting rooms. Edward once told a funny story about life in the palace. Buckingham Palace was so big that people often got lost. One night, my mother, my father, and I were waiting for dinner. We waited for a long time, but the food did not come. After 20 minutes, my father became angry. He went to the kitchen and shouted, "Where is the cook? Where is my dinner?" "But, sir," said the cook, "your food left the kitchen 15 minutes ago." "Well, it hasn't come yet and I'm hungry," the king said. He started to look for the food himself. 10 minutes later, he found a woman holding 3 plates of meat and potatoes. "What happened?" my father asked. "Why didn't you bring our dinner?" "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "There are so many dining rooms. I forgot which one you were in. But if you go back to the table, I can follow you this time." Edward did not go to school with other children. He studied alone in a special classroom inside Buckingham Palace. "My teacher, Mr. Hansel," Edward wrote, "was a thin man with a red nose. He never smiled. The books were full of long words and had no pictures. They were very boring. Sometimes I looked out of the window instead of reading, and Mr. Hansel got angry. He hit me on the arm with a stick. My arm became red and sore. Every Friday he took me to see my father. The king always asked, 'What has my son learned this week, Mr. Hansel?' And Mr. Hansel always said, 'Not much, sir. Edward doesn't like his lessons. He never listens to me.' After Mr. Hansel left, my father got angry. 'What's wrong with you, child?' he said. 'Are you stupid? Why can't you learn anything?' 'But the lessons are boring, sir,' I said. And Mr. Hansel hits me. 'You are weak, Edward,' my father said coldly. 'A king must be strong. Go to your room and stay there until morning.' I spent many days alone in my room. I never played with other children, and I had no friends. I lived in the most beautiful house in England, but I was always lonely and sad. I saw my mother once a day at dinner and my father a few times a week, but they never showed me love. I was afraid of them, and everything I did seemed wrong. Chapter 2. The Prince of Wales. In the spring of 1911, King George called his son Edward to his room. "Next month," said the king, "I will make you the Prince of Wales. These are the clothes you will wear for the ceremony." He opened a small cupboard, and Edward's eyes filled with tears. "But father," he said, "I'm 16 now. I can't wear soft shoes and a skirt. I'll look like a girl. Why can't I wear normal clothes like other people?" "Because you are special," his father answered. "One day you will be king." Edward cried for 2 days, but he knew he could not change anything. On June 10th, 1911, the royal family travelled to Carnarvon Castle in North Wales for the big ceremony. The king placed a small gold crown on Edward's head. There was music, dancing, and cheering from the crowd. The new Prince of Wales closed his eyes. "I feel terrible," he whispered. "Can we go home now?" "Not yet," said the king. "The people want to see you. Edward walked to the front of the castle and looked down at the crowd. His hands were shaking, and his face turned red. "Smile, Edward," his father told him. "You are happy." A few hours later, they were on their way back to Windsor. "Wasn't that a lovely day?" said Queen Mary cheerfully. Edward took off his shoes and looked out of the window. "Never again," he thought. "Never again." Chapter 3. The Royal Star. After spending a year at Oxford University, Edward went to fight in the First World War. He later wrote, "I lived in a house with 25 other soldiers. At night we talked about our lives and families. That was very interesting. For the first time, I could speak freely with all kinds of people, rich and poor, young and old. But I also saw the terrible things of war, the blood, the noise, and the fear." One day in 1916, Edward's driver took him to the town of Loos in Belgium. Edward got out of the car and walked up a hill. From the top, he saw heavy fighting below. The noise and the death made him feel very sad. An hour later, he went back to the car, but his driver was dead. Someone had shot him in the neck while Edward was away. Edward never forgot that moment. When the war ended in 1918, Edward returned to Buckingham Palace. One evening he sat with his father in the dining room. "I don't understand why countries fight," Edward said. "The war is over, but nothing has changed. Millions of people are still poor and hungry. It isn't right. Someone must do something." "Well," King George replied, "you can't change the world by sitting by the fire. You must travel, meet people, and listen to them. Then when you become king, you can make the world better." So, in 1920, Edward left England again. Over the next 5 years, he traveled 240,000 kilometers and visited 45 countries. He went to India, Argentina, Nigeria, Mexico, New Zealand, Germany, and Japan. When he arrived in Toronto, Canada, 500,000 people filled the streets to see him. Everywhere he went, huge crowds waited. 190,000 in Cape Town, 300,000 in Paris, 500,000 in New York, and 750,000 in Melbourne. A newspaper wrote, "Edward is the first royal star. He is now the most famous man in the world. In the past, princes were cold and distant. But Edward is different. He gets out of his car and walks among the people. Every few minutes he stops to talk, laugh, and shake hands. He is a man of the people, a prince with a heart of gold." Chapter 4. The Meeting. In the autumn of 1930, Edward went to visit his friends, Lord and Lady Furness. He later wrote about that weekend in his book, A King's Story. It was a cold and windy Saturday. Heavy rain was falling, so we could not ride our horses. We decided to stay indoors and have an early lunch with some of Lady Furness's friends. At 1 o'clock, Wallis arrived with her husband. She was beautifully dressed and smiling all the time. After speaking with Lord Furness for a few minutes, Lady Furness brought her to me. "Sir," she said, "I would like you to meet one of my dearest American friends, Mrs. Wallis Simpson." "How do you do, Mrs. Simpson?" I said. "Please come and sit down." Lady Furness left us alone, and we began to talk. I noticed that Wallis did not look well. Her eyes were red, and she had a bad cold. "I'm afraid our English houses are not very warm," I said kindly. "We don't have American central heating here." There was a long silence. Then Wallis turned to look out of the window. "You have disappointed me, sir," she said suddenly. "Why is that?" I asked. "Because everyone talks to me about American central heating. I thought the Prince of Wales would say something more interesting." I started to laugh. "What's so funny, sir?" Wallis asked. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," I said, still smiling. "I'm laughing because you told me the truth. Why is that strange? Doesn't everyone tell you the truth? Not really, I said. One day I will be King of England, and people are afraid of me. If I say the sky is yellow, they agree. If I say Wednesday is the first day of the week, they agree. And if I say Scotland is bigger than Canada, they still agree. But you told me I was boring. And that was honest. I like that. Wallace laughed softly. May I say one more thing, sir? Of course, Mrs. Simpson. What is it? It's about your trousers, sir. My trousers? Yes, they're black, but your shoes are brown. Those two colors don't go together. I stood up and looked in the mirror. You're right, Mrs. Simpson. I look quite strange. Next time we meet, I'll be better dressed. When lunch was ready, we went into the dining room. I sat at one end of the long table, and Wallace sat at the other. I watched her carefully. I noticed how beautiful her hands were. She talked to Lady Furness for a while, then turned to me and smiled. I felt very happy. After lunch, Wallace came to say goodbye. My husband and I must leave now, sir, she said. We're going to another party in London. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the right words. We shook hands and she walked away. Later, I sat beside Lady Furness and said, Tell me about Mrs. Simpson. What would you like to know? She asked. Everything, I said. Then perhaps, sir, we should walk in the garden. She suggested. We can talk more freely there. We went out through the back door and walked slowly among the trees. As we walked, Lady Furness told me more about Wallace. Chapter 5. Wallace. Lady Furness told Edward the story of Mrs. Simpson's early life. Wallace was born in Baltimore, she said. She never really knew her father. He died when she was only 5 months old. But her mother was a strong and loving woman, and Wallace grew up a happy child. When Wallace was 20, she married a man named Winfield Spencer. At first, they were happy together. But one day Winfield lost some money in the street. He came home very angry, took a bottle of whiskey, and started drinking. That night he hit Wallace in the mouth. She screamed, and he hit her again. There was blood on her face, and she was shaking with fear. Please, Winfield, she said softly. No more. But Winfield grabbed her arm and pulled her upstairs. You're my prisoner, he shouted. You're not going anywhere. Then he pushed her into the bathroom and locked the door. The next morning, Wallace went back to her family. I can't stay with him, she said. I want a divorce. Poor Wallace, said Edward. But what happened next, Lady Furness? Well, Lady Furness continued, a few months later she met a good man named Ernest Simpson. He's quiet but interesting. They got married and now they live in a lovely flat in the centre of London. And are they happy? Edward asked. Lady Furness smiled softly. I don't know, sir, she said. I really don't know. During the next 2 years, Edward saw Wallace once or twice every week. They had many of the same friends and often met at parties. Mrs. Simpson knew a lot about life, Edward later said. She loved books, good food, people, and travel. She was beautiful, with eyes full of fire. She was easy to talk to, and after some time, I opened my heart to her. We had no secrets. I told her everything, and that's how it all began. Wallace also spoke about Edward. His eyes were always sad, she said. Sometimes he looked like a child, so young, quiet, and gentle. He had no true friends. People were a little afraid of him, but he was warm and kind. When he talked to me, my heart jumped. I wanted to be alone with him, though I knew that wasn't right. Did he love me at first? No, I don't think so. But each time we met, we grew closer. In June 1933, Edward gave Wallace a birthday party. After that, he started visiting the Simpsons' flat almost every day. One evening, he invited Wallace and her husband Ernest to go skiing in Austria. "I'm sorry, sir," Mr. Simpson said. "I have to go to America on business, but perhaps Wallace and her aunt could go with you. We went to Kitzbühel's friends." Wallace wrote later. "But when we came home, we were in love, and a few months later, the prince asked me to marry him. It felt just like a dream." Chapter 6. The King is Dead. Long live the King. In January 1936, Edward went to Windsor for a short holiday. He was tired of city life and wanted some quiet days to work in his garden and ride his horses. But one afternoon, the phone rang. It was his mother, Queen Mary. "Edward," she said, "you must come back at once. Your father is very ill. I think he is going to die." Edward hurried to his father's room. He walked to the side of the bed and kissed the king's pale face. The king opened his eyes and gave a weak smile. Then he took Edward's hand and whispered, "Be a good king, Edward, and be kind to your mother." "Yes, father, I will," Edward said softly. The king closed his eyes again and never spoke another word. Just after midnight, he died. Queen Mary took Edward's hand and kissed it. "My child," she said gently, "you are now the king. God be with you." One by one, Edward's 3 brothers came into the room. They each kissed his hand and said, "The king is dead. Long live the king." At 1 o'clock in the morning, Edward went to the telephone and called Wallace. "My father is dead," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry, sir," Wallace replied. "I must stay here for a while." Edward continued, "But I'll call you at the weekend. Nothing will change between us. I love you more than ever, and you will be my queen." "Please, let's not talk about that now," Wallace said. "You must be with your family." "But you are my family, Wallace," he said softly. "You are everything to me. Good night. Sleep well." That night, after Wallace put down the phone, she sat in silence. A sudden fear filled her heart. "Edward is now the king," she thought. "But what will happen to me?" Chapter 7. The Church. In the spring of 1936, Mrs. Simpson wrote a letter to her husband. "Dear Ernest, you have always been very kind to me. You are a good and strong man. But I must tell you that our marriage is over. I am in love with the king, and I want a divorce. Please don't be angry. There is nothing you can do. I will never forget you, but I have to be free." Ernest answered her letter right away. "Your letter came this morning. I will do what you ask, but I will never stop loving you. And if you ever need me, I'll always be here." That night, the king and Wallace met in a small restaurant in Piccadilly. Edward read Ernest's letter again and again. "That's wonderful news," he said happily. "Nothing can stop us now." The next morning, when Edward came down to breakfast, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Gordon Lang, was waiting for him. "Good morning, Gordon," the king said politely. "How nice to see you again. What can I do for you?" For a moment, the Archbishop said nothing. Then he opened a small black bag and took out 3 newspapers. "I have come to speak to you about Mrs. Wallace Simpson," he began. "The newspapers say that you want to marry her. Are these stories true, sir?" "Yes, Gordon," said the king calmly. "Wallace will be my wife." "That's not possible," replied the Archbishop. "You know what the Church teaches about marriage and divorce. Divorce is wrong in the eyes of God." Edward smiled slightly and said, "Can I ask you a few questions about God, Mr. Lang?" "Yes, of course, sir." "Is God happy when 2 people fall in love?" "Yes, sir, but—" "And is God happy when 2 people fall in love and get married?" "Yes, sir, but—" And is God happy when two people fall in love, get married, and live happily together? Yes, sir, but— Then, Archbishop, said Edward, Wallace and I will make God very happy. We are in love, we will marry, and we will live happily together. The Archbishop looked worried. But you don't understand, sir, he said. The Church says that divorce is wrong. Mrs. Simpson cannot leave Mr. Simpson and then marry you. You must forget her and find another woman. Please, sir, I ask you to think again. That is not possible, Edward said quietly. When Wallace is free, I shall marry her. There was a long silence. The Archbishop looked down at the floor and shook his head. You're making a great mistake, sir, he said. The Church is very strong, and we will never accept this woman as our queen. Edward suddenly stood up. His face was red with anger. Thank you for coming, he said coldly. But I have nothing more to say. I want to be alone. The Archbishop stood up to leave, but he gently touched the king's arm. Please, sir, think again. The Church will be against you. I don't care. Edward replied firmly. I have God on my side, and that's all I need. Goodbye, Mr. Lang. Chapter 8. The Storm. In July and August, Wallace and the king sailed across the Mediterranean Sea. They met Prime Minister Metaxas in Greece, Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, and King Boris in Bulgaria. But that summer became famous for something very different: Edward's clothes. On the way from Athens to Istanbul, the king took off his shirt to enjoy the sun. It was a hot day, and after a few minutes he fell asleep. He didn't notice the young photographer, who was quietly taking pictures of him. When Edward returned from the Mediterranean, a letter was waiting for him. It was from Mr. Albert Thompson of Birmingham. The letter said, I saw your picture in the newspaper this morning, and I was very angry. I have never seen a king dressed so badly. No shirt, no tie, no socks, no hat, and wearing short trousers. How could you, sir? Edward showed the letter to the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. What do you think of this? Edward asked. Mr. Thompson is right, sir, the Prime Minister replied. You want to be modern, but the people don't like it. Edward threw the letter into the fire. And do you think divorce is modern, Mr. Baldwin? He asked. The Prime Minister sat down. Sir, I've read about Mrs. Simpson. She has 2 husbands still alive. You must understand what that means. She cannot marry a king. But I cannot live without her, Edward said quietly. Then, sir, Baldwin replied, I can see a storm coming. I've spoken to your family and to Archbishop Lang. We will not accept this woman as our queen. That night, the Prime Minister and the king talked for many hours. There were many questions, but only one answer. Early the next morning, Edward finally said, You tell me that Wallace cannot marry a king. Then there is only one thing I can do. I will give the crown to my brother and leave England. I must follow my heart. You tell me that love is a crime, that it's wrong to be happy. How strange this country is. An hour later, Edward called Wallace. The Prime Minister says a storm is coming, he said. So I want you to go away for a while. Wallace packed her bags and left for France. Then Edward went to see his mother. It was a sad and difficult meeting. Do you know what you are doing? Queen Mary asked. Look out of that window. There are 400 million people who call you king. They need you. And you would give all of this up for Mrs. Simpson? Yes, mother, Edward said. I'm in love. Love! The Queen cried. You are a king! You must love your country first! But I am also a man, Edward said softly. And there is nothing I can do. That afternoon, the king called one of his closest friends, Winston Churchill. I have sad news, Edward said. Last night, Mr. Baldwin came to see me. I've decided to leave next week. Do you mean for a holiday, sir? Churchill asked. No, Winston. I'm leaving England. I'm never coming back. George will be king. But that's not right, sir. Churchill said, You are a free man. You must stand and fight. No. The king replied, I've seen war. It's a terrible thing. I don't want to fight again, but the people love you. Churchill said, They want Wallis to be queen. Perhaps they do. Edward said quietly, But you cannot be queen. My enemies are stronger than I am. I am just a sailor, and when the wind changes, the sea moves and takes my boat away. Chapter 9. The Woman I Love. A few days later, Mr. Churchill came to see Edward at Buckingham Palace. At first, the king was quiet. Then he said, This is my last night in England, Winston. I love this country. I wanted to be a modern, kind king. I wanted to make the world better, but they stopped me. Now I have to go. It was 10 o'clock. Edward stood up and walked to the window. Outside, in the dark streets, hundreds of people were standing together. They were singing and shouting his name. Edward! Edward! We love Edward! Long live the king! Long live love! Suddenly, Edward turned to Churchill. Why is this happening to me, Winston? He cried. What have I done wrong? He sat down and put his head in his hands. The room was silent, but from outside came the voices of the people. Long live Edward! Long live love! Long live Edward! Long live love! Churchill walked over and gently put his hand on the king's arm. Edward looked up. Thank you, Winston, he said. You have been a good friend to me. Thank you, sir, Churchill replied. And you have been a good king. The next morning, at 10 o'clock, the telephone rang in Edward's bedroom. They're ready for you now, sir, said a voice. Edward walked slowly down the stairs. The door to the next room stood open. Inside, his family was waiting. His mother sat by the window in a black dress. His brothers stood beside her. How close they all are, Edward thought sadly. On a small table in the middle of the room was a single piece of paper. Edward sat down and read the words. I, Edward VIII, King of Great Britain, King of India, King of Australia, King of New Zealand, King of Canada, King of Kenya, King of Nigeria, King of Burma, King of Malaya, King of Singapore, and King of 32 other countries, have today given the crown to my brother George. God be with him and all his people. 10th December 1936, Edward picked up a pen and signed his name. Then he stood and kissed his brother's hand. I never wanted this to happen. George said softly, This is the worst day of my life. Edward went to his mother. Before I kiss you, Queen Mary said, There are some things I must say. I have never understood you, my child. This morning you were a king, and tonight you will leave England like a thief, alone, angry, afraid. You think you are free, but you are not. Everyone needs their family, everyone needs their home, and tonight you have lost both. I love you. I am your mother, and that will never change. But if you marry that woman, you will break my heart. Go now. It is all very sad. Edward kissed his mother's hand and turned to leave. The next day he returned to Windsor Castle. He went to a small, cold room high in the building. From there, he spoke on BBC radio to Britain and the world. Tonight, for the first time, I can speak to you. Earlier today, I gave the crown to my brother George. He is now your king. I will soon leave this country and go to France. My heart is with Wallis, and I cannot live without the woman I love. I don't know what will happen to me, or if I will ever see England again. But think of me tonight as I sail across the sea. God be with you. Long live King George. After the speech, Edward left Windsor Castle and got into a large black car. It was midnight, and the rain had just begun to fall. "Take me away as quickly as you can," he said quietly. The car drove off into the dark night and rain. "What a night," said the driver. "It's as if the sky is crying, sir." At 1:30 in the morning, they arrived at Portsmouth. Edward stepped out of the car, and someone called, "The King is here!" Edward stopped and looked across the dark sea. A small, sad smile appeared on his face. "King," he said softly. "No, I am not the king. I am just a man in love." Then he turned, walked onto the ship, and disappeared into the night. Chapter 10. The Wedding. The next morning, Edward called Wallace from Boulogne. "Did you hear me on the radio?" he asked. "Yes, of course," she said. "And how did you feel?" "I was sitting alone in my room," Wallace replied. "When I listened to your words, I felt so sad. I put my hands over my eyes and cried. I couldn't stop myself. You gave up everything for me. But I love you so much, Edward. With me you'll be the happiest man in the world." "I already am," he said softly. "You are all that matters in my life." 6 months later, on June 3rd, 1937, Edward married Wallace Simpson. None of the royal family came to the wedding. Edward was 43 years old, and Wallace was 41. After the wedding, they were given new titles, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. A few weeks later, Edward wrote to his brother, King George, "I was surprised that you didn't come to the wedding. But Wallace is now my wife, and nothing can change that. We have a house in Paris, but France is not my home. I want to live at Windsor again, with Wallace by my side." King George replied, "I'm sorry, Edward, but you know how I feel about that woman. I do not like her. I will never like her. You may live here, but Wallace cannot." Edward later said, "My brother pushed me away like a dog. I will never forget what he did. After that, I decided I didn't need my family. They didn't want Wallace, so I didn't want them." Chapter 11. Paris. For the next 30 years, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived in Paris. They gave many parties and travelled around the world, but they never returned to Buckingham Palace. When King George died in 1952 and Queen Mary died in 1961, Edward went back to Windsor for a few days. Wallace stayed in France. "It's your family," she said quietly, "not mine." Then, in 1966, the Duke and Duchess met Queen Elizabeth, King George's daughter, at a small party in London. After 30 years, it was time to forget the past. Elizabeth kissed Wallace and touched her arm gently. Then she turned to the Duke and said, "Wallace is so beautiful, Uncle. I think you are a lucky man. That day, Elizabeth was very kind to us." Edward wrote later, "But I often wonder, why couldn't my mother or my brother ever say those words to me?" In 1969, the Duke and Duchess spoke together on BBC television. "Do you ever argue?" someone asked them. "No, not really," Wallace answered. "But there is one thing about my husband that I really don't like. He is always late. It doesn't matter if he's meeting a queen, a president, or a film star. He can never arrive on time. I've tried to change him, but it's impossible." The Duke smiled and touched her hand. "I know I'm often late," he said, "but on our wedding day I arrived at the church 20 minutes before you. I was early, and you were late." "Yes, that's true," Wallace said, and they both laughed. You could see real love in their eyes. One newspaper wrote, "They were on television, but they forgot about the cameras and the millions of people watching. They were just two people in love." Wallace was famous for her jewelry. "After my husband, she once said. I love jewelry more than anything else in the world. After 35 years with Edward, she had hundreds of pieces from all over the world. I have never met a more beautiful woman than Wallis. Edward wrote, She has given me so much happiness. I buy her jewels to say thank you. In May 1972, the Duke became very ill. When the doctor came, he listened to Edward's heart and asked, How many cigarettes do you smoke each day, sir? About 40 or 50, Edward replied. But please don't ask me to stop. I've smoked for 60 years. I can't change now. That night, Edward called Wallis into the room. I feel very tired, he said softly, and I'm afraid. I love you. You've been a wonderful wife. When I die, please take my body back to Windsor. Will you do that for me? Yes, of course, she said, and they both began to cry. The Duke of Windsor died 1 hour later, with Wallis by his side. 3 days later, a blue aeroplane arrived in Paris. Wallis returned to England with the Duke's body. For the first time in her life, she entered Buckingham Palace. A week later, the Duchess went back to France. For the next 14 years, she lived alone in Paris. The big house was dark. The doors were locked. She rarely went outside. In the afternoons, she sat in the dining room with Edward's love letters. They were so beautiful, she said. I read them again and again. In 1986, Wallis became very ill. She went to a small hospital near her home, and a few days later, she died. Without Edward, she once wrote, my life was empty. She was buried in England beside her husband at Windsor. It's strange, one newspaper wrote. When they were alive, the Duke and Duchess could never live in Britain. It was only in death that they could be there together. Chapter 12. Long Live Love. In 1970, 2 years before his death, Edward said, There are people who think I was wrong to give up my crown. But they don't understand what real love means. When I was young, I lived in Buckingham Palace. I could have anything I wanted, but I wasn't happy. My heart felt empty. Then I met Wallis and everything changed. For half of my life, I have lived with the most beautiful woman in the world. She is everything to me. Sometimes, when I sit in the garden with the Duchess by my side, I think about my past. I remember the long days alone in my room. I remember the teacher who hit me with a stick. I remember the war and all the places I traveled to. And I remember the people standing below my window shouting, Long live love! On my last night in London, I talked with Winston Churchill. In the middle of our conversation, he said to me, Sir, the best things in life are free. I have never forgotten those words, and now, many years later, I truly understand them. You cannot buy happiness, and you cannot buy love. To be happy deep in your heart is the most wonderful thing in the world. I have been a lucky man, and so I say, thank God for Wallis and long live love. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales of love and life. What would you choose, a crown or true love? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, love is the only crown that never falls.